So I want to share a bit of a stream of consciousness today, and it's about an idea that I've been reflecting on and contemplating for quite a while. And the basic idea is that identity is a narrative structure. Um, what I mean by that is that the self is a story. Um, that's the basic idea, really simple idea. And I want to unpack it in this video because I think it's absolutely fascinating. And more than being fascinating, it seems true. It seems to me that it's difficult for me to see how this is not the case. And I'm really open to hearing other perspectives on it because I'm really curious about these ideas. But okay, so the self is a story, or identity is a narrative structure. Okay, what does that mean? Well, um, I'm drawing inspiration from the Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson, who wrote a book called Maps of Meaning, which is basically the textbook or the course book for his Maps of Meaning course, which he ran at Harvard University. I think it's Harvard University. He ran at Harvard in the 90s, I think. And you can go on YouTube and type in Jordan Peterson Maps of Meaning Harvard, and you'll get a video series of his entire course, which I recommend you go and do because it's absolutely fascinating. And I'd also recommend buying the book because the amount of information in that book is just it's crazy. It's crazy. It's really, really dense, detailed, specific, grounded in science and grounded in more narrative or metaphoric thinking too. So I'm drawing on Jordan Peterson, and Jordan Peterson in turn is drawing on Carl Jung, and Carl Jung in turn. And so Carl Jung was really the student of Sigmund Freud, and Carl Jung really invented a lot of important psychological concepts. For example, extrovert and introvert, they are Jungian ideas, and we've absorbed those ideas into our culture pretty quickly. And synchronicity as well, and the idea of a complex, an emotional complex, and the idea of projection. Projecting your unconscious desires, your unconscious fears onto other people or to the world. These kind of ideas, which I think have been absorbed by our culture and are pretty commonplace psychological ideas, were all, the contribution of Carl Jung. So he was a really important psychologist in the 20th century. So Jordan Peterson and Carl Jung are the two figures, I would say, that are influencing and informing this perspective that I'm sharing with you. And the thing is about Jung, who, as I say, was really the origin for a lot of Jordan Peterson's work. Jordan Peterson, I would say, is updating Jung for a contemporary audience. What Jung was saying was Jung was drawing on a lot of fairy tales. He's literally looking at fairy tales, right, stories. He's looking at myths, the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, religious myth, the Christian myth in the Bible, and different myths basically, and Jung and dreams, which dreams are narrative structures too. So you've got fairy tales, myths, and dreams. These, for Jung, comprised a whole body of information, and it's a body of narrative information, a body of stories, essentially. And for Jung, these stories contained really important and pure and kind of unfiltered, or like raw, I think is the best way to think of it, like raw psychological information. So Jung, I would say Jung and Peterson were both informed by old stories, basically. Like both of their corpus, their work, their body of works, I would say, are rooted or grounded in old narrative structures, old stories. Cool. So that's a bit of context and a bit of context about the idea I'm gonna lay out for you today. So, self as a story, or identity as a narrative. Okay, so who are you? Is the question I would ask you. And then if you pause the video, click pause, or just stop and think about your answer to that question. What I would say is that the way you're going to answer that question is by telling me a story. You're going to say, my name's Sam, and I do this for a living. I'm interested in this type of music. I'm interested in this type of art or activity or hobbies. I've always been passionate about this. This is what I value. This is what I want to do. Some of those things I would wager would come into the response to the question, who are you? So like intrinsically, you have to tell yourself a story about who you are. In fact, who you are is a narrative, it is a story. And what do I mean by a story? I mean like an account of your past and your future, these kind of different vectors of time, looking backwards and looking forwards, and a kind of account of the events that led you to who you are. And usually that account will include some form of challenge or some sort of difficulty or some sort of trauma or some sort of problem or some sort of thing that you're wrestling with, that you're seeking to overcome. And it will probably include an account of that in your past, and then a projection into your future of like what you value and the kind of world you'd like to create, or what values and ideals you hold dear, and the way you see things. I mean, this all sounds quite abstract, and I suppose it is quite abstract, but I think it's quite practical. So like, you tell different stories at different levels of analysis. So like, even the way you describe who you are and what you do and what you're passionate about, even the emotion or the pathos behind those words, that's a story. Oh, I do this. Oh, I do this. Oh, this is what I want to do. Like, even the emotional tone behind it is part of the narrative, part of the story. It's part of the context within which you wrap up this idea of your identity. So there's let me just break down the idea of story according to, I think it's Aristotle's rhetoric. Aristotle thought like rhetoric, like the ability to persuasively communicate, was predicated on three things. I think it was Aristotle, I could be wrong, but he said pathos, logos, and ethos. Pathos being emotion. Okay, so he basically says like a good persuasive communicator exhibits pathos, logos, and ethos. Pathos is emotion, feeling, right? Passion. And that's a real like emotional charge. It's like an energy. It's like a charisma. And that gives a message, an inspiring quality, or maybe not an inspiring quality, maybe a sad quality, maybe a tragic quality, maybe an angry quality, maybe there's different levels to the emotional spectrum, but pathos comes in whichever mood you're in, whether it's joyous, optimistic, pessimistic, apathetic, depressed, cynical, angry, excited, creative, open-minded, all of these different kind of spectrums on the palette of your emotions, they tell a story. The emotion itself tells a story. The way you communicate some content contextualizes the content, obviously enough, right? This is why human beings are very sensitive to tone. Tone, that's a musical metaphor. Tone, like, because there's different, like, I don't know huge amounts about it, but it's like, the chromatic scale with like the 7 different scales and the different tones that can be hit in a musical note or in a piano. And similarly, we can say messages and we can tell stories in a certain tone. And if we say the same word or the same thing, the same logical content, if we say that in an angry context or a peaceful context or a calm context or an excited and enthusiastic context, the emotion behind it tells a story. Okay, it's as simple as that, because it communicates how we feel about the content. Okay, and that comes through when you answer the question, "Who am I?" Or it doesn't even need to be that deep, like, "Who are you?" But just even in our daily conversation, "Hey, what have you been up to?" "Oh, I just did this a few weeks ago and this a few months ago." How are you speaking about that? Is it exciting? Is it promising? Is it scary? Is it fearful? Like, what's the tone behind that story you're telling? So you don't even need to go like, "Who are you?" But like, just daily conversation and dialogue is a narrative exchange. And part of the narrative is pathos. Okay, the emotionality, or like the feeling tone behind the content. That's like one layer of the story, right? And then the second layer is the logos. And the logos, that's just the rational, that's just how coherent your narrative is. So like, yes, it's a pretty boring story, but like yesterday I was hungry, and so then I decided to put my shoes on and walk out the door and just go to the shop, which is like 3 minutes walk away, and I got some food. I came back and I cooked the food and I ate it, and then I wasn't hungry anymore. Really boring story, I'm sorry. But so the logos of that is the point is that to your mind, it's at least it's a coherent narrative. So it's like, I'm hungry, therefore I desire food, and these are the sequence of things that I did to satiate my hunger. And it has a narrative context. It's a narrative framework that is coherent and kind of it's just in conformity with the laws of logic and common sense. And this is an interesting idea too, is like, a story making sense, or like, if someone doesn't make sense, what does that mean, make sense? It's kind of you know bit of a kind of like strange thing to say, but we all have an idea of what it means when someone's making sense. And when someone's making sense, it means their words are coherent. They interact with each other in a harmonious way. So like, I'm hungry, therefore going to get food would be a good thing. So therefore I put my shoes on, went out the door, went to my shop where they sell food, bought some food, came home and cooked the food. So it's like my actions were in congruence with the intent. So like my situation was, I'm hungry, and therefore my actions are in congruence with that. And so it makes sense, right? Makes sense. So pathos and logos. So the story needs to make sense, and the story needs to, and so that's another element of the logos as well, is like the congruency between the feeling and the words. And if we detect a mismatch between them, often we'll go, are you sure? Or maybe we'll dig a bit deeper with our friends and say, you don't sound too excited about that, or like, that sounds really exciting, tell me more. These different things help us to go deeper into the narrative and to understand the big picture of what's going on in their lives. And then ethos is the third principle from Aristotle, and ethos is like ethic or character. And so that's just like, do your actions match your words? So it's like the feeling, the word, and the act all sync up in a harmony. And the degree to which those three levels of analysis are in congruence and are coherent and are unified, then the story makes sense to us. The emotional level, the logical level of the words, and then the embodied level of like the person you're speaking to, what achievements they've had, what things they've done, you know, their life situation, just the clear evidence of what you see and what they're doing and how they're acting and how they're treating other people and all of these things, right? And so if the pathos and the logos and the ethos sync into a harmony, then the story is really, really compelling. And then that's persuasion, basically, because the harmony of the story resonates with from the communicator who's sending a message to the receiver of the message. There's a harmony, and they're like, haha. And so then that harmony means that these two people, who are two separate people, can unify in the same narrative structure, and therefore there can be a shared vision, a shared action sequence, a shared pattern of behavior. And really that's what persuasion is, fundamentally. So I don't know where I'm going with all of this. So right, okay, yeah, I mean, so like, I think that's an interesting thing to consider, just that you yourself is a story, your identity is a story. Now, and then there's two kind of stories which are like, if you look at like the Cain and Abel story in the Bible, you know, you've got a kind of resentful and cynical and bitter story, which is Cain, I think. And then you've got a hopeful, optimistic, and kind of righteous story. And really that's the story of good and evil, or hero and nemesis. So like, you know, just Christ and the devil are the classic archetypes of good and evil, or like Frodo and Gollum in Lord of the Rings, hero and nemesis, right? The hero is the story or the narrative pathway which is righteous, and which is, instead of righteous, I might say just good or virtuous or aiming at the good. And then the nemesis is the narrative pathway that's aiming at the bad, basically, and has an evil intent, like a noble intent and an evil intent. And you know, those are narrative pathways that we can. Those are stories that we are capable of telling ourselves. That's the thing, right? Is that if the self is a story, then you have this whole spectrum of stories that you're able to tell yourself. And that's where psychology gets really, really interesting and potentially incredibly dangerous. You know, that's really where, you know, if you look at cults, cults are really belief systems, really rigid belief systems and narratives where people will sacrifice crazy things to and do crazy things because the narrative coherence that is offered by the cult is so strong and so important to their identity. It is their sense of self. And so if that narrative is threatened, then they themselves feel threatened. Like their entire identity feels threatened and undermined if that narrative is undermined. Yeah, so like ideology and cults and all of these things could be considered pathologies of narrative, where a story structure has become very rigid and fixed and is not capable of updating itself, so to speak. It's not capable of breaking apart and transforming into a different story. It's not living and dynamic, it's dead and stagnant. This dead and stagnant story is what a dogma is, or an ideology is. A very fixed story, like this is how I see the world, these are my beliefs, this is the future I see, this is what actions are allowable, you know, this is how the world is, a narrative structure. And so I think there's there's dangers in this truth that the self is a story, because words are powerful. Words really are powerful because words weave the narratives of who we are. So it's something to be sensitive to, and that opens up into like all of the media you consume. Like, do you consume, like, what narrative are you attending to? What are you attending to? What narrative threads are contributing to your sense of identity? What newspapers do you read? What online media do you consume? What books do you read? What people do you speak to? What narratives are you kind of assimilating and absorbing? Because those narratives are constituting who you are at a very fundamental level. This is very strong in the Christian tradition, where they say, like, they equivocate, I think, Christ with the word. So the redeeming figure in Christianity, the central deity, really, is equivalent to the logos, or it's the creative word, and the communicative principle. This is associated with a chakra here. I think it's like the 5th chakra in the Vedic systems, and it's like the throat chakra, and it's to do with truth or deceit. And either truth or deceit, both of them, are weaved by the tongue. Stick my tongue up. Yeah, this is the Bible speaks of the tongue as basically a creative and destructive force, which it is. Like, the tongue is a liberating force, a force for good and a force for truth. And the tongue is a destructive and corrupting force, a force that serves darkness and evil, because of the lie, because of deceit. And deceit is woven through the tongue. And the way I kind of think of deceit is kind of, as I laid out to you before, I think of it in terms of harmony. So do the levels of reality, does the emotion, do the actions of the people speaking, do the actions of the people speaking, the emotion behind it, the context of the emotional field behind the story, and to the words themselves, do these things interrelate in a coherent, cohesive, unified, and harmonious manner? And I think that's this sensitivity for harmony is what music enables us to taste, really. Music helps to inform our sense of harmony, and therefore I feel that music orients us towards beauty and truth through an exhibition of harmony. And I think that narratives can be understood to be true to the degree that they harmonize, which means that they are consistent or coherent across multiple domains of analysis. The images, the perceptions, the images, the actions, the words, the meanings, the emotions, all of these things are singing together, really. Gone a bit all over the place. So story is a potentially powerful creative tool, and it's also a potentially destructive tool as well. And so the power of the word, the power of the tongue, this throat chakra here, is a power, and it's not to be underestimated. It's incredibly powerful, both for the good and the bad. And to the extent that you are unconscious of that, which means you're not attending to that, you're not aware of that, then it's probably a force for bad. It's probably a destructive force, because probably some other narrative, some other ideological narrative is weaving its way inside your mind and distorting or like influencing your perception of reality itself and the stories you tell. So it pays to be conscious of the narrative nature of identity, it pays to become aware of that, to attend to that, and to pay attention to it, which is the intent behind this video, is to bring attention to it. And then I also said that like narrative is pathos, ethos, and logos, feeling, character, and logic. Yeah, look, it's also this evolving story of our past and our future. Oh, I'm not a very good singer, as an example, right? Just even saying that, oh, I'm not a very good singer. Let me just take that as a little microcosm of the stories we tell. That's something I would probably say, oh, I'm not a very good singer. Why do I say that? Because I go back into my memory bank of my history, let's say the past, and I go, what are these experiences of me singing? Well, I remember as a kid, I was singing. I was like 9 or 10 years old, and I was singing, and my parents laughed at me and said, I'm not a very good singer. And that was fair, because I wasn't a very good singer. My voice was completely out of tune, and so that was fair. But then, I didn't really attempt to sing since, and that one memory is the memory that comes to mind for me. And I just don't really put myself in situations where I sing publicly, because I don't feel confident in it. I don't feel like I'm a very good singer. But it's kind of like Mufasa says in The Lion King. He says to Simba, Simba, you are more than what you have become. Love that one. So okay, fine. So I'm not a good singer is a narrative, it's a story I'm telling based on like the karma of my past. Okay, based on basically the karma of my past, like the emotional reference points in my past are now determining my present and my future, and I'm not going to put myself in situations where I need to sing. I'm not going to. It's closing down certain potentials for me, right? And I'm actually going to describe that. I'm going to say that to people I meet, and then they're going to kind of feed that back to me, and that's just going to be my reality. It's like I'm not a very good singer. But is it like true? Like it's a story I'm telling, definitely, and that story limits the context of my potential. It limits because if I say I'm not a very good singer, then I don't need to put myself in situations where I need to sing. Now, it's a bit of a weird example, because I don't know if if that's what I want to do, or like whether I should be singing. Maybe I should be, maybe I shouldn't be. Who knows? But what's my point about the singer thing? My point is that singing, like anything, it's not just singing, it's like any art form, any creative thing, any task, any thing we say, whether we're good or bad at it, it's an identity. So the whole like I'm not a good singer thing becomes an identity, because it's a story I keep telling myself, and maybe I've been telling it my whole life. But does that mean that I couldn't learn to be a good singer? Does that mean that that's completely the case? Could I not rewrite that story? And could I not challenge that narrative? And could I not generate a new narrative? Could I not tell a new story? Of course I could, and of course you could. And that's my point, is that the magic really of being a human being is that you are the storyteller, and to be aware of the stories you're telling and to rewrite those stories is our great power. because that's how we open up new potentials. That's how we open new doors for ourselves, and we open up new pathways, because we change the language, we shift the words, we shift the emotional tone behind it. We shift the words, we shift the emotional tone, we shift our actions, we shift the things we're doing, and slowly but surely a new narrative emerges. And this new narrative is a new identity. And with the new identity comes new actions and new possibilities and new achievements in the world. And it's all dependent on narrative, because I'm not a good singer closes down a whole area of human potential. That is what it does. It's a prison, our words become prisons. It doesn't matter if it's a singer or an artist or a painter or anything really. It's like doesn't really matter how you describe yourself, but just be conscious of it, right? Because often our experiences in our past determine our current narrative, and our narrative around how good we are at that thing or not becomes our prison. It becomes a cage to our potential. And really, the way to liberate our potential is to become aware of the narrative and to challenge it and to create a new narrative. How do we do that? Often listening to inspiring people, looking at the actions that they're taking in the world, the ethos, listening to the logos, listening to the logic and the stories they tell and the coherence of those stories, and listening to the pathos, the passion of those stories. They inspire us or give us new spirit, new life, a new anima, a new animus, a new principle for life, a new vitality for life. These speakers sow the seeds of new narratives or open up new narrative threads within us, you see. Speakers do that, and then books do that. So like, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, it's a narrative, and it's like, whoa, like it's an amazing way to see life, and it opens up new ways to interpret and to see the world, really. I think that's the great power of books too. Is books are narrative forms, and they influence our identity when we consume them. So books and so writing and speaking and movies as well. Movies give us all this inspiration for different potentials within the human spirit. So all of these things, are subtly influencing our narratives, our sense of self, and there's real power in that. There's real power in that, because we are the words of our ancestors, and we are the stories of our movies. We are Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and The Matrix and Shawshank Redemption. And these films are us. They really are us, because they offer us narratives. They offer us powerful narratives. Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and The Matrix and Shawshank, all of those four examples, some of the biggest movies ever made, are redemptive narratives. If you boil down the narrative, it's a redemptive narrative. That's the unifying principle between all of them. That means the world is threatened by chaos and evil. The world is threatened to be destroyed by some evil force, and a hero emerges who journeys forthrightly into the heart of darkness to redeem the world and create a new and better world. That same redemptive narrative, the narrative arc, is it runs throughout Christianity too. It's very, very, very powerful narrative. And maybe that's what I'll finish the video on, is that I would say that Jung's psychology is completely predicated on the idea that to heal and to feel whole and to heal, basically, and to live a healthy life, we need a redemptive narrative as individuals. That's what we need. We need it because there's these problems, there's these obstacles, there's this pain, there's this suffering in our lives, and that's the chaos, that's the evil that's threatening to destroy us, and it weighs down on us. It's like an oppressive force, like the oppressive forces of evil. That existential force is a part of life, and the redemptive narrative says yes, and you are capable of overcoming that and transforming that, and actually creatively wrestling with that to produce and create something beautiful and new and good, and just something good. Like, you're capable of creating a good and better world through your thoughts, acts, and words. That basic idea, that basic story, that basic narrative is at the core of the Christian myth. Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Matrix, Shawshank Redemption, the Shawshank Redemption. I think that's listed as IMDb's top movie ever. Yeah, because it tells the story the best way. It's a redemptive narrative, and that's my point. Is that redemptive narratives are really some of the deepest narratives that we have, and it's because they offer us hope, and they offer us an optimistic vision of life, and they offer us the potential to create a life that is authentically our own, and aligned to our culture, our history, and to who we really are, and to who we really could be. I think Jordan Peterson is telling a redemptive story, which is why he's become wildly successful on YouTube, and over recent years has just risen to a great degree of popularity. It's because he's telling a redemptive story. And I think that to the extent that we as individuals tell ourselves a redemptive story, is to the extent to which we heal, and are able to really realize our potential in life. Which is why watching films like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, reading things like the Bible, watching The Shawshank Redemption, listening to Jordan Peterson, different things like that, different stories like that, different narratives like that, acquainting ourselves with them, attending to them, help to sow new seeds up here, and help to weave new narrative arcs up here. And that has a very powerful and important effect upon us, I feel. So that's just some thoughts really on the narrative nature of identity. I'd love to hear your comments and your perspectives on this. I don't see how it cannot be the case, but if there's any other perspectives on it, I'd love to hear them. Yeah, and I just wanted to share that. I've been thinking about it for quite a while. I'm going to probably share a lot more on this theme, but I thought I'd make an introduction to it. So hopefully that was useful to you guys. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate that. And if you enjoyed the content, do just subscribe below. That would be really cool. Amazing. See you later.